Chapter 15. And out in the jungle, far away, Korak, covered with wounds, stiff with clotted blood, burning with rage and sorrow, swung back upon the trail of the great baboons. He had not found them where he had last seen them, nor in any of their usual haunts, but he sought them along the well-marked spoor they had left behind them, and at last he overtook them. When first he came upon them, they were moving slowly but steadily southward in one of those periodic migrations, the reasons for which the baboon himself is best able to explain. And at sight of the white warrior who came upon them from downwind, the herd halted in response to the warning cry of the sentinel that had discovered him. There was much growling and muttering, much stiff-legged circling on the part of the bulls. The mothers, in nervous, high-pitched tones, called their young to their sides and with them moved to safety behind their lords and masters. Korak called aloud to the king, who at the familiar voice advanced slowly, warily, and still stiff-legged. He must have the confirmatory evidence of his nose before venturing to rely too implicitly upon the testimony of his ears and eyes. Korak stood perfectly still. To have advanced then might have precipitated an immediate attack, or as easily a panic of flight. Wild beasts are creatures of nerves. It is a relatively simple thing to throw them into a species of hysteria which may induce either a mania for murder or symptoms of apparent abject cowardice. It is a question, however, if a wild animal ever is actually a coward. The king baboon approached Korak. He walked around him in an ever-decreasing circle, growling, grunting, sniffing. Korak spoke to him. "I am Korak," he said. "I opened the cage that held you. I saved you from the Tarmangani. I am Korak, the killer. I am your friend." "Ha," grunted the king. "Yes, you are Korak. My ears told me that you were Korak. My eyes told me that you were Korak. Now my nose tells me that you are Korak. My nose is never wrong. I am your friend. Come, we shall hunt together." "Korak cannot hunt now," replied the ape-man. "The Gomangani have stolen Miriam. They have tied her in their village. They will not let her go. Korak alone was unable to set her free. Korak set you free. Now will you bring your people and set Korak's Miriam free?" "The Gomangani have many sharp sticks which they throw. They pierce the bodies of my people. They kill us. The Gomangani are bad people. They will kill us all if we enter their village." "The Tarmangani have sticks that make a loud noise and kill at a great distance," replied Korak. "They had these when Korak set you free from their trap. If Korak had run away from them, you would now be a prisoner among the Tarmangani." The baboon scratched his head. In a rough circle about him and the ape-man squatted the bulls of his herd. They blinked their eyes, shouldered one another about for more advantageous positions, scratched in the rotting vegetation upon the chance of unearthing a toothsome worm, or sat listlessly eyeing their king and the strange Mangani, who called himself thus but who more closely resembled the hated Tarmangani. The king looked at some of the older of his subjects, as though inviting suggestion. "We are too few," grunted one. "There are the baboons of the hill country," suggested another. "They are as many as the leaves of the forest. They too hate the Gomangani. They love to fight. They are very savage. Let us ask them to accompany us. Then can we kill all the Gomangani in the jungle?" He rose and growled horribly, bristling his stiff hair. "That is the way to talk," cried the killer. "But we do not need the baboons of the hill country. We are enough. It will take a long time to fetch them. Miriam may be dead and eaten before we could free her. Let us set out at once for the village of the Gomangani. If we travel very fast, it will not take long to reach it. Then, all at the same time, we can charge into the village, growling and barking. The Gomangani will be very frightened and will run away. While they are gone, we can seize Miriam and carry her off. We do not have to kill or be killed. All that Korak wishes is his Miriam." "We are too few," croaked the old ape again. "Yes, we are too few," echoed others. Korak could not persuade them. They would help him gladly, but they must do it in their own way, and that meant enlisting the services of their kinsmen and allies of the hill country, so Korak was forced to give in. All he could do for the present was to urge them to haste, and at his suggestion the king baboon with a dozen of his mightiest bulls agreed to go to the hill country with Korak, leaving the balance of the herd behind. Once enlisted in the adventure, the baboons became quite enthusiastic about it. The delegation set off immediately. They traveled swiftly, but the ape-man found no difficulty in keeping up with them. They made a tremendous racket as they passed through the trees in an endeavor to suggest to enemies in their front that a great herd was approaching, for when the baboons travel in large numbers, there is no jungle creature who cares to molest them. When the nature of the country required much travel upon the level, and the distance between trees was great. They moved silently, knowing that the lion and the leopard would not be fooled by noise when they could see plainly for themselves that only a handful of baboons were on the trail. For 2 days the party raced through the savage country, passing out of the dense jungle into an open plain, and across this to timbered mountain slopes. Here Korak never before had been. It was a new country to him, and the change from the monotony of the circumscribed view in the jungle was pleasing, but he had little desire to enjoy the beauties of nature at this time. His Miriam was in danger. Until she was freed and returned to him, he had little thought for aught else. Once in the forest that clothed the mountain slopes, the baboons advanced more slowly. Constantly they gave tongue to a plaintive note of calling. Then would follow silence while they listened. At last, faintly from the distance straight ahead came an answer. The baboons continued to travel in the direction of the voices that floated through the forest to them in the intervals of their own silence. Thus, calling and listening, they came closer to their kinsmen who, it was evident to Korak, were coming to meet them in great numbers. But when, at last, the baboons of the hill country came in view, the ape-man was staggered at the reality that broke upon his vision. What appeared a solid wall of huge baboons rose from the ground through the branches of the trees to the loftiest terrace to which they dared entrust their weight. Slowly they were approaching, voicing their weird, plaintive call, and behind them, as far as Korak's eyes could pierce the verdure, rose solid walls of their fellows treading close upon their heels. There were thousands of them. The ape-man could not but think of the fate of his little party should some untoward incident arouse even momentarily the rage of fear of a single one of all these thousands. But nothing such befell. The two kings approached one another, as was their custom, with much sniffing and bristling. They satisfied themselves of each other's identity. Then each scratched the other's back. After a moment they spoke together. Korak's friend explained the nature of their visit, and for the first time Korak showed himself. He had been hiding behind a bush. The excitement among the hill baboons was intense at sight of him. For a moment Korak feared that he should be torn to pieces, but his fear was for Miriam. Should he die, there would be none to succor her. The two kings, however, managed to quiet the multitude, and Korak was permitted to approach. Slowly the hill baboons came closer to him. They sniffed at him from every angle. When he spoke to them in their own tongue, they were filled with wonder and delight. They talked to him and listened while he spoke. He told them of Miriam, and of their life in the jungle, where they were the friends of all the ape folk from little Manu to Mangani, the great ape. The Gomangani who are keeping Miriam from me are no friends of yours, he said. They kill you. The baboons of the low country are too few to go against them. They tell me that you are very many and very brave, that your numbers are as the numbers of the grasses upon the plains or the leaves within the forest, and that even Tantor, the elephant, fears you. So brave you are. They told me that you would be happy to accompany us to the village of the Gomangani and punish these bad people while I, Korak the killer, carry away my Miriam. The king ape puffed out his chest and strutted about very stiff-legged indeed. So also did many of the other great bulls of his nation. They were pleased and flattered by the words of the strange Tarmangani, who called himself Mangani and spoke the language of the hairy progenitors of man. Yes, said one, we of the hill country are mighty fighters. Tantor fears us, Numa fears us, Shita fears us. The Gomangani of the hill country are glad to pass us by in peace. I, for one, will come with you to the village of the Gomangani of the low places. I am the king's first child. Alone can I kill all the Gomangani of the low country, and he swelled his chest and strutted proudly back and forth, until the itching back of a comrade commanded his industrious attention. I am Goob, cried another. My fighting fangs are long, they are sharp, they are strong. Into the soft flesh of many a Gomangani have they been buried. Alone I slew the sister of Shita. Goob will go to the low country with you and kill so many of the Gomangani that there will be none left to count the dead. And then he too strutted and pranced before the admiring eyes of the shes and the young. Korak looked at the king, questioningly. Your bulls are very brave, he said, but braver than any is the king. Thus addressed, the shaggy bull, still in his prime, else he had been no longer king, growled ferociously. The forest echoed to his lusty challenges. The little baboons clutched fearfully at their mothers' hairy necks. The bulls, electrified, leaped high in air and took up the roaring challenge of their king. The din was terrific. Korak came close to the king and shouted in his ear. Come, then he started off through the forest toward the plain that they must cross on their long journey back to the village of Kuvudu, the Gomangani. The king, still roaring and shrieking, wheeled and followed him. In their wake came the handful of low-country baboons and the thousands of the hill-clan savage, wiry dog-like creatures athirst for blood. And so they came, upon the second day, to the village of Kovudu. It was mid-afternoon. The village was sunk in the quiet of the great equatorial sun heat. The mighty herd traveled quietly now. Beneath the thousands of padded feet, the forest gave forth no greater sound than might have been produced by the increased soughing of a stronger breeze through the leafy branches of the trees. Korak and the two kings were in the lead. Close beside the village they halted until the stragglers had closed up. Now utter silence reigned. Korak, creeping stealthily, entered the tree that overhung the palisade. He glanced behind him. The pack were close upon his heels. The time had come. He had warned them continuously during the long march that no harm must befall the white she who lay a prisoner within the village. All others were their legitimate prey. Then, raising his face toward the sky, he gave voice to a single cry. It was the signal. In response, 3,000 hairy bulls leapt screaming and barking into the village of the terrified blacks. Warriors poured from every hut. Mothers gathered their babies in their arms and fled toward the gates as they saw the horrid horde pouring into the village street. Kovudu marshaled his fighting men about him, and leaping and yelling to arouse their courage, offered a bristling, spear-tipped front to the charging horde. Korak, as he had led the march, led the charge. The blacks were struck with horror and dismay at the sight of this white-skinned youth at the head of a pack of hideous baboons. For an instant they held their ground, hurling their spears once at the advancing multitude, but before they could fit arrows to their bows they wavered, gave and turned in terrified rout. Into their ranks, upon their backs, sinking strong fangs into the muscles of their necks, sprang the baboons, and first among them, most ferocious, most bloodthirsty, most terrible was Korak, the killer. At the village gates, through which the blacks poured in panic, Korak left them to the tender mercies of his allies and turned himself eagerly toward the hut in which Miriam had been a prisoner. It was empty. One after another, the filthy interiors revealed the same disheartening fact: Miriam was in none of them. That she had not been taken by the blacks in their flight from the village Korak knew, for he had watched carefully for a glimpse of her among the fugitives. To the mind of the ape-man, knowing as he did the proclivities of the savages, there was but a single explanation: Miriam had been killed and eaten. With the conviction that Miriam was dead, there surged through Korak's brain a wave of blood-red rage against those he believed to be her murderer. In the distance he could hear the snarling of the baboons mixed with the screams of their victims, and towards this he made his way. When he came upon them, the baboons had commenced to tire of the sport of battle, and the blacks in a little knot were making a new stand, using their knobsticks effectively upon the few bulls who still persisted in attacking them. Among these broke Korak from the branches of a tree above them, swift, relentless, terrible. He hurled himself upon the savage warriors of Kovudu. Blind fury possessed him. Too, it protected him by its very ferocity. Like a wounded lioness, he was here, there, everywhere, striking terrific blows with hard fists and with the precision and timeliness of the trained fighter. Again and again he buried his teeth in the flesh of a foeman. He was upon one and gone again to another before an effective blow could be dealt him. Yet, though great was the weight of his execution in determining the result of the combat, it was outweighed by the terror which he inspired in the simple, superstitious minds of his foemen. To them this white warrior, who consorted with the great apes and the fierce baboons, who growled and snarled and snapped like a beast, was not human. He was a demon of the forest, a fearsome god of evil whom they had offended, and who had come out of his lair deep in the jungle to punish them. And because of this belief there were many who offered but little defense, feeling as they did the futility of pitting their puny mortal strength against that of a deity. Those who could fled, until at last there were no more to pay the penalty for a deed which, while not beyond them, they were, nevertheless, not guilty of. Panting and bloody, Korak paused for want of further victims. The baboons gathered about him, sated themselves with blood and battle. They lolled upon the ground, fagged. In the distance Kovudu was gathering his scattered tribesmen and taking account of injuries and losses. His people were panic-stricken. Nothing could prevail upon them to remain longer in this country. They would not even return to the village for their belongings. Instead, they insisted upon continuing their flight until they had put many miles between themselves and the stamping ground of the demon who had so bitterly attacked them. And thus it befell that Korak drove from their homes the only people who might have aided him in a search for Miriam. and cut off the only connecting link between him and her from whomsoever might come in search of him from the douar of the kindly Bwana who had befriended his little jungle sweetheart. It was a sour and savage Korak who bade farewell to his baboon allies upon the following morning. They wished him to accompany him, but the ape-man had no heart for the society of any. Jungle life had encouraged taciturnity in him. His sorrow had deepened this to a sullen moroseness that could not brook even the savage companionship of the ill-natured baboons. Brooding and despondent, he took his solitary way into the deepest jungle. He moved along the ground when he knew that Numa was abroad and hungry. He took to the same trees that harbored Sheeta, the panther. He courted death in 100 ways and 100 forms. His mind was ever occupied with reminiscences of Miriam and the happy years that they had spent together. He realized now to the full what she had meant to him. The sweet face, the tanned, supple little body, the bright smile that always had welcomed his return from the hunt haunted him continually. Inaction soon threatened him with madness. He must be on the go, he must fill his days with labor and excitement, that he might forget that night might find him so exhausted that he should sleep in blessed unconsciousness of his misery until a new day had come. Had he guessed that by any possibility Miriam might still live, he would at least have had hope. His days could have been devoted to searching for her, but he implicitly believed that she was dead. For a long year he led his solitary roaming life. Occasionally he fell in with a Kut in his tribe, hunting with them for a day or two, or he might travel to the hill country where the baboons had come to accept him as a matter of course, but most of all was he with Tantor, the elephant, the great grey battleship of the jungle, the super dreadnought of his savage world. The peaceful quiet of the monster bulls, the watchful solicitude of the mother cows, the awkward playfulness of the calves rested, interested, and amused Korak. The life of the huge beasts took his mind, temporarily, from his own grief. He came to love them as he loved not even the great apes, and there was one gigantic tusker in particular of which he was very fond, the lord of the herd, a savage beast that was wont to charge a stranger upon the slightest provocation, or upon no provocation whatsoever. And to Korak this mountain of destruction was docile and affectionate as a lapdog. He came when Korak called. He wound his trunk about the ape-man's body and lifted him to his broad neck in response to a gesture. And there would Korak lie at full length, kicking his toes affectionately into the thick hide and brushing the flies from about the tender ears of his colossal chum with a leafy branch torn from a nearby tree by Tantor for the purpose. And all the while Miriam was scarce 100 miles away. Chapter 16. To Miriam, in her new home, the days passed quickly. At first she was all anxiety to be off into the jungle searching for her Korak, Bwana, as she insisted upon calling her benefactor, dissuaded her from making the attempt at once by dispatching a headman with a party of blacks to Kovudu's village with instructions to learn from the old savage how he came into possession of the white girl, and as much of her antecedents as might be culled from the black chieftain. Bwana particularly charged his headman with the duty of questioning Kovudu relative to the strange character whom the girl called Korak, and of searching for the ape-man if he found the slightest evidence upon which to ground a belief in the existence of such an individual. Bwana was more than fully convinced that Korak was a creature of the girl's disordered imagination. He believed that the terrors and hardships she had undergone during captivity among the blacks and her frightful experience with the two Swedes had unbalanced her mind, but as the days passed and he became better acquainted with her and able to observe her under the ordinary conditions of the quiet of his African home, he was forced to admit that her strange tale puzzled him not a little, for there was no other evidence whatever that Miriam was not in full possession of her normal faculties. The white man's wife, whom Miriam had christened my dear, from having first heard her thus addressed by Bwana, took not only a deep interest in the little jungle waif, because of her forlorn and friendless state, but grew to love her as well for her sunny disposition and natural charm of temperament. And Miriam, similarly impressed by little attributes in the gentle, cultured woman, reciprocated the other's regard and affection. And so the days flew by while Miriam waited the return of the headman and his party from the country of Kovudu. They were short days, for into them were crowded many hours of insidious instruction of the unlettered child by the lonely woman. She commenced at once to teach the girl English without forcing it upon her as a task. She varied the instruction with lessons in sewing and deportment, nor once did she let Miriam guess that it was not all play. Nor was this difficult, since the girl was avid to learn. Then there were pretty dresses to be made to take the place of the single leopard skin, and in this she found the child as responsive and enthusiastic as any civilized miss of her acquaintance. A month passed before the headman returned, a month that had transformed the savage, half-naked little Tarmangani into a daintily frocked girl of at least outward civilization. Miriam had progressed rapidly with the intricacies of the English language, for Bwana and my dear had persistently refused to speak Arabic from the time they had decided that Miriam must learn English, which had been a day or two after her introduction into their home. The report of the headman plunged Miriam into a period of despondency, for he had found the village of Kovudu deserted, nor, search as he would, could he discover a single native anywhere in the vicinity. For some time he had camped near the village, spending the days in a systematic search of the environs for traces of Miriam's Korak, but in this quest too, had he failed, he had seen neither apes nor ape-man. Miriam at first insisted upon setting forth herself in search of Korak, but Bwana prevailed upon her to wait. He would go himself, he assured her, as soon as he could find the time, and at last Miriam consented to abide by his wishes, but it was months before she ceased to mourn almost hourly for her Korak. My dear grieved with the grieving girl and did her best to comfort and cheer her. She told her that if Korak lived he would find her, but all the time she believed that Korak had never existed beyond the child's dreams. She planned amusements to distract Miriam's attention from her sorrow, and she instituted a well-designed campaign to impress upon the child the desirability of civilized life and customs. Nor was this difficult, as she was soon to learn, for it rapidly became evident that beneath the uncouth savagery of the girl was a bedrock of innate refinement, a nicety of taste and predilection that quite equaled that of her instructor. My dear was delighted. She was lonely and childless, and so she lavished upon this little stranger all the mother love that would have gone to her own had she had one. The result was that by the end of the first year none might have guessed that Miriam ever had existed beyond the lap of culture and luxury. She was 16 now, though she easily might have passed for 19, and she was very good to look upon, with her black hair and her tanned skin and all the freshness and purity of health and innocence. Yet she still nursed her secret sorrow, though she no longer mentioned it to my dear. Scarce an hour passed that did not bring its recollection of Korak and its poignant yearning to see him again. Miriam spoke English fluently now and read and wrote it as well. One day my dear spoke jokingly to her in French, and to her surprise Miriam replied in the same tongue slowly, "It is true," and haltingly, but none the less in excellent French, such though as a little child might use. Thereafter they spoke a little French each day, and my dear often marveled that the girl learned this language with a facility that was at times almost uncanny. At first Miriam had puckered her narrow, arched little eyebrows as though trying to force recollection of something all but forgotten which the new words suggested, and then, to her own astonishment, as well as to that of her teacher, she had used other French words than those in the lessons, used them properly, and with a pronunciation that the Englishwoman knew was more perfect than her own, but Miriam could neither read nor write what she spoke so well. And as my dear considered a knowledge of correct English of the first importance, other than conversational French was postponed for a later day. "You doubtless heard French spoken at times in your father's douar," suggested my dear, as the most reasonable explanation. Miriam shook her head. "It may be," she said, "but I do not recall ever having seen a Frenchman in my father's company. He hated them and would have nothing whatever to do with them. And I am quite sure that I never heard any of these words before, yet at the same time I find them all familiar. I cannot understand it." "Neither can I," agreed my dear. It was about this time that a runner brought a letter that, when she learned the contents, filled Miriam with excitement. Visitors were coming. A number of English ladies and gentlemen had accepted my dear's invitation to spend a month of hunting and exploring with them. Miriam was all expectancy. What would these strangers be like? Would they be as nice to her as had Bwana and my dear, or would they be like the other white folk she had known, cruel and relentless? My dear assured her that they all were gentle folk and that she would find them kind, considerate, and honorable. To my dear's surprise, there was none of the shyness of the wild creature in Miriam's anticipation of the visit of strangers. She looked forward to their coming with curiosity and with a certain pleasurable anticipation when once she was assured that they would not bite her. In fact, she appeared no different than would any pretty young miss who had learned of the expected coming of company. Korak's image was still often in her thoughts, but it aroused now a less well-defined sense of bereavement. A quiet sadness pervaded Miriam when she thought of him, but the poignant grief of her loss when it was young no longer goaded her to desperation. Yet she was still loyal to him. She still hoped that someday he would find her, nor did she doubt for a moment but that he was searching for her if he still lived. It was this last suggestion that caused her the greatest perturbation. Korak might be dead. It scarce seemed possible that one so well equipped to meet the emergencies of jungle life should have succumbed so young, yet when she had last seen him, he had been beset by a horde of armed warriors, and should he have returned to the village again, as she well knew he must have, he may have been killed. Even her Korak could not, single-handed, slay an entire tribe. At last the visitors arrived. There were 3 men and 2 women, the wives of the 2 older men. The youngest member of the party was Honourable Morrison Baines, a young man of considerable wealth who, having exhausted all the possibilities for pleasure offered by the capitals of Europe, had gladly seized upon this opportunity to turn to another continent for excitement and adventure. He looked upon all things un-European as rather more than less impossible. Still, he was not at all averse to enjoying the novelty of unaccustomed places, and making the most of strangers indigenous thereto, however unspeakable they might have seemed to him at home. In manner he was suave and courteous to all, if possible a trifle more punctilious toward those he considered of meaner clay than toward the few he mentally admitted to equality. Nature had favored him with a splendid physique and a handsome face, and also with sufficient good judgment to appreciate that while he might enjoy the contemplation of his superiority to the masses, there was little likelihood of the masses being equally entranced by the same cause. And so he easily maintained the reputation of being a most democratic and likable fellow, and indeed he was likable. Just a shade of his egotism was occasionally apparent, never sufficient to become a burden to his associates. And this, briefly, was the Honourable Morrison Baines of luxurious European civilization. What would be the Honourable Morrison Baines of Central Africa, it were difficult to guess. Miriam at first was shy and reserved in the presence of the strangers. Her benefactors had seen fit to ignore mention of her strange past, and so she passed as their ward, whose antecedents, not having been mentioned, were not to be inquired into. The guests found her sweet and unassuming, laughing, vivacious, and a never-exhausted storehouse of quaint and interesting jungle lore. She had ridden much during her year with Bwana and my dear. She knew each favorite clump of concealing reeds along the river that the buffalo loved best. She knew a dozen places where lions laired, and every drinking hole in the drier country 25 miles back from the river. With unerring precision that was almost uncanny, she could track the largest or the smallest beast to his hiding place. But the thing that baffled them all was her instant consciousness of the presence of carnivora that others, exerting their faculties to the utmost, could neither see nor hear. The Honourable Morrison Baines found Miriam a most beautiful and charming companion. He was delighted with her from the first, particularly so, it is possible, because he had not thought to find companionship of this sort upon the African estate of his London friends. They were together a great deal, as they were the only unmarried couple in the little company. Miriam, entirely unaccustomed to the companionship of such as Baines, was fascinated by him. His tales of the great, gay cities with which he was familiar filled her with admiration and with wonder. If the Honourable Morrison always shone to advantage in these narratives, Miriam saw in that fact but a most natural consequence to his presence upon the scene of his story. Wherever Morrison might be, he must be a hero, so thought the girl. With the actual presence and companionship of the young Englishman, the image of Korak became less real. Where before it had been an actuality to her, she now realized that Korak was but a memory. To that memory she still was loyal, but what weight has a memory in the presence of a fascinating reality? Miriam had never accompanied the men upon a hunt since the arrival of the guests. She never had cared particularly for the sport of killing. The tracking she enjoyed, but the mere killing for the sake of killing she could not find pleasure in, little savage that she had been and still, to some measure, was. When Bwana had gone forth to shoot for meat, she had always been his enthusiastic companion, but with the coming of the London guests the hunting had deteriorated into mere killing. Slaughter the host would not permit, yet the purpose of the hunts were for heads and skins and not for food. So Miriam remained behind and spent her days either with my dear upon the shaded veranda, or riding her favorite pony across the plains or to the forest edge. Here she would leave him untethered while she took to the trees for the moment's unalloyed pleasures of a return to the wild, free existence of her earlier childhood. Then would come again visions of Korak, and tired at last of leaping and swinging through the trees, she would stretch herself comfortably upon a branch and dream. And presently, as today, she found the features of Korak slowly dissolve and merge into those of another, and the figure of a tanned, half-naked Tarmangani become a khaki-clothed Englishman astride a hunting pony. And while she dreamed, there came to her ears from a distance faintly the terrified bleating of a kid. Miriam was instantly alert. You or I, even had we been able to hear the pitiful wail at so great distance, could not have interpreted it, but to Miriam it meant a species of terror that afflicts the ruminant when a carnivore is near and escape impossible. It had been both a pleasure and a sport of Korak's to rob Numa of his prey whenever possible, and Miriam, too, had often joyed in the thrill of snatching some dainty morsel, almost from the very jaws of the king of beasts. Now, at the sound of the kid's bleat, all the well-remembered thrills recurred. Instantly she was all excitement to play again the game of hide-and-seek with death. Quickly she loosened her riding skirt and tossed it aside. It was a heavy handicap to successful travel in the trees. Her boots and stockings followed the skirt, for the bare sole of the human foot does not slip upon dry, or even wet bark as does the hard leather of a boot. She would have liked to discard her riding breeches also, but the motherly admonitions of my dear had convinced Miriam that it was not good form to go naked through the world. At her hip hung a hunting knife. Her rifle was still in its boot at her pony's withers. Her revolver she had not brought. The kid was still bleating as Miriam started rapidly in its direction, which she knew was straight toward a certain waterhole which had once been famous as a rendezvous for lions. Of late there had been no evidence of carnivora in the neighborhood of this drinking place, but Miriam was positive that the bleating of the kid was due to the presence of either lion or panther. But she would soon know, for she was rapidly approaching the terrified animal. She wondered as she hastened onward that the sounds continued to come from the same point. Why did the kid not run away? And then she came in sight of the little animal and knew. The kid was tethered to a stake beside the waterhole. Miriam paused in the branches of a nearby tree and scanned the surrounding clearing with quick, penetrating eyes. Where was the hunter? Bwana and his people did not hunt thus. Who could have tethered this poor little beast as a lure to Numa? Bwana never countenanced such acts in his country, and his word was law among those who hunted within a radius of many miles of his estate. Some wandering savages, doubtless, thought Miriam, but where were they? Not even her keen eyes could discover them. And where was Numa? Why had he not long since sprung upon this delicious and defenseless morsel? And that he was close by was attested by the pitiful crying of the kid. Ah, now she saw him. He was lying close in a clump of brush a few yards to her right. The kid was downwind from him, and getting the full benefit of his terrorizing scent, which did not reach Miriam. To circle to the opposite side of the clearing where the trees approached closer to the kid. To leap quickly to the little animal's side and cut the tether that held him would be the work of but a moment. In that moment Numa might charge, and then there would be scarce time to regain the safety of the trees, yet it might be done. Miriam had escaped from closer quarters than that many times before. The doubt that gave her momentary pause was caused by fear of the unseen hunters more than by fear of Numa. If they were stranger blacks, the spears that they held in readiness for Numa might as readily be loosed upon whomever dared release their bait as upon the prey they sought thus to trap. Again the kid struggled to be free. Again his piteous wail touched the tender heartstrings of the girl. Tossing discretion aside, she commenced to circle the clearing. Only from Numa did she attempt to conceal her presence. At last she reached the opposite trees. An instant she paused to look toward the great lion, and at the same moment she saw the huge beast rise slowly to his full height. A low roar betokened that he was ready. Miriam loosened her knife and leaped to the ground. A quick run brought her to the side of the kid. Numa saw her. He lashed his tail against his tawny sides. He roared terribly, but, for an instant, he remained where he stood, surprised into inaction, doubtless by the strange apparition that had sprung so unexpectedly from the jungle. Other eyes were upon Miriam, two eyes in which were no less surprised than that reflected in the yellow-green orbs of the carnivore. A white man, hiding in a thorn boma, half rose as the young girl leaped into the clearing and dashed toward the kid. He saw Numa hesitate. He raised his rifle and covered the beast's breast. The girl reached the kid's side. Her knife flashed, and the little prisoner was free. With a parting bleat it dashed off into the jungle. Then the girl turned to retreat toward the safety of the tree from which she had dropped so suddenly and unexpectedly into the surprised view of the lion, the kid, and the man. As she turned, the girl's face was turned toward the hunter. His eyes went wide as he saw her features. He gave a little gasp of surprise, but now the lion demanded all his attention. The baffled, angry beast was charging. His breast was still covered by the motionless rifle. The man could have fired and stopped the charge at once, but for some reason, since he had seen the girl's face, he hesitated. Could it be that he did not care to save her? Or did he prefer, if possible, to remain unseen by her? It must have been the latter cause which kept the trigger finger of the steady hand from exerting the little pressure that would have brought the great beast to at least a temporary pause. Like an eagle, the man watched the race for life the girl was making. A second or two measured the time which the whole exciting event consumed from the moment that the lion broke into his charge. Nor once did the rifle sights fail to cover the broad breast of the tawny sire as the lion's course took him a little to the man's left. Once, at the very last moment, when escape seemed impossible, the hunter's finger tightened ever so little upon the trigger, but almost coincidentally the girl leaped for an overhanging branch and seized it. The lion leaped too, but the nimble Miriam had swung herself beyond his reach without a second or an inch to spare. The man breathed a sigh of relief as he lowered his rifle. He saw the girl fling a grimace at the angry, roaring Manito beneath her, and then, laughing, speed away into the forest. For an hour the lion remained about the waterhole. 100 times could the hunter have bagged his prey. Why did he fail to do so? Was he afraid that the shot might attract the girl and cause her to return? At last Numa, still roaring angrily, strode majestically into the jungle. The hunter crawled from his boma, and half an hour later was entering a little camp snugly hidden in the forest. A handful of black followers greeted his return with sullen indifference. He was a great bearded man, a huge yellow-bearded giant when he entered his tent. Half an hour later he emerged smooth-shaven. His blacks looked at him in astonishment. "Would you know me?" he asked. "The hyena that bore you would not know you," Bwana replied one. The man aimed a heavy fist at the black's face, but long experience in dodging similar blows saved the presumptuous one. Chapter 17. Miriam returned slowly toward the tree in which she had left her skirt, her shoes, and her stockings. She was singing blithely, but her song came to a sudden stop when she came within sight of the tree, for there, disporting themselves with glee and pulling and hauling upon her belongings, were a number of baboons. When they saw her, they showed no signs of terror. Instead, they bared their fangs and growled at her. What was there to fear in a single Shitarmangani? Nothing, absolutely nothing. In the open plain beyond the forest, the hunters were returning from the day's sport. They were widely separated, hoping to raise a wandering lion on the homeward journey across the plain. The Honorable Morrison Baines rode closest to the forest. As his eyes wandered back and forth across the undulating, shrub-sprinkled ground, they fell upon the form of a creature close beside the thick jungle, where it terminated abruptly at the plain's edge. He reined his mount in the direction of his discovery. It was yet too far away for his untrained eyes to recognize it, but as he came closer he saw that it was a horse, and was about to resume the original direction of his way when he thought that he discerned a saddle upon the beast's back. He rode a little closer. Yes, the animal was saddled. The Honorable Morrison approached yet nearer, and as he did so his eyes expressed a pleasurable emotion of anticipation, for they had now recognized the pony as the special favorite of Miriam. He galloped to the animal's side. Miriam must be within the wood. The man shuddered a little at the thought of an unprotected girl alone in the jungle that was still, to him, a fearful place of terrors and stealthily stalking death. He dismounted and left his horse beside Miriam's. On foot he entered the jungle. He knew that she was probably safe enough, and he wished to surprise her by coming suddenly upon her. He had gone but a short distance into the wood when he heard a great jabbering in a nearby tree. Coming closer, he saw a band of baboons snarling over something. Looking intently, he saw that one of them held a woman's riding skirt, and that others had boots and stockings. His heart almost ceased to beat as he quite naturally placed the most direful explanation upon the scene. The baboons had killed Miriam and stripped this clothing from her body. Morrison shuddered. He was about to call aloud in the hope that after all the girl still lived when he saw her in a tree close beside that was occupied by the baboons, and now he saw that they were snarling and jabbering at her. To his amazement, he saw the girl swing, ape-like, into the tree below the huge beasts. He saw her pause upon a branch a few feet from the nearest baboon. He was about to raise his rifle and put a bullet through the hideous creature that seemed about to leap upon her when he heard the girl speak. He almost dropped his rifle from surprise as a strange jabbering, identical with that of the apes, broke from Miriam's lips. The baboons stopped their snarling and listened. It was quite evident that they were as much surprised as the Honorable Morrison Baines. Slowly and one by one they approached the girl. She gave not the slightest evidence of fear of them. They quite surrounded her now, so that Baines could not have fired without endangering the girl's life, but he no longer desired to fire. He was consumed with curiosity. For several minutes the girl carried on what could be nothing less than a conversation with the baboons, and then with seeming alacrity every article of her apparel in their possession was handed over to her. The baboons still crowded eagerly about her as she donned them. They chattered to her and she chattered back. The Honourable Morrison Baines sat down at the foot of a tree and mopped his perspiring brow. Then he rose and made his way back to his mount. When Miriam emerged from the forest a few minutes later, she found him there, and he eyed her with wide eyes in which were both wonder and a sort of terror. "I saw your horse here," he explained, "and thought that I would wait and ride home with you. You do not mind?" "Of course not," she replied. "It will be lovely." As they made their way stirrup to stirrup across the plain, the Honourable Morrison caught himself many times watching the girl's regular profile and wondering if his eyes had deceived him or if in truth he really had seen this lovely creature consorting with grotesque baboons and conversing with them as fluently as she conversed with him. The thing was uncanny, impossible, yet he had seen it with his own eyes. And as he watched her, another thought persisted in obtruding itself into his mind. She was most beautiful and very desirable, but what did he know of her? Was she not altogether impossible? Was the scene that he had but just witnessed not sufficient proof of her impossibility? A woman who climbed trees and conversed with the baboons of the jungle. It was quite horrible. Again the Honourable Morrison mopped his brow. Miriam glanced toward him. "You are warm," she said. "Now that the sun is setting, I find it quite cool. Why do you perspire now?" He had not intended to let her know that he had seen her with the baboons, but quite suddenly, before he realized what he was saying, he had blurted it out. "I perspire from emotion," he said. "I went into the jungle when I discovered your pony. I wanted to surprise you, but it was I who was surprised. I saw you in the trees with the baboons." "Yes," she said quite unemotionally, as though it was a matter of little moment that a young girl should be upon intimate terms with savage jungle beasts. "It was horrible," ejaculated the Honourable Morrison. "Horrible," repeated Miriam, puckering her brows in bewilderment. "What was horrible about it? They are my friends. Is it horrible to talk with one's friends?" "You were really talking with them," then cried the Honourable Morrison. "You understood them and they understood you." "Certainly. But they are hideous creatures, degraded beasts of a lower order. How could you speak the language of beasts?" "They are not hideous, and they are not degraded," replied Miriam. "Friends are never that. I lived among them for years before Bwana found me and brought me here. I scarce knew any other tongue than that of the Mangani. Should I refuse to know them now simply because I happen, for the present, to live among humans?" "For the present," ejaculated the Honourable Morrison. "You cannot mean that you expect to return to live among them? Come, what foolishness are we talking? The very idea! You are spoofing me, Miss Miriam. You have been kind to these baboons here and they know you and do not molest you, but that you once lived among them. No, that is preposterous." "But I did, though," insisted the girl, seeing the real horror that the man felt in the presence of such an idea reflected in his tone and manner, and rather enjoying baiting him still further. "Yes, I lived, almost naked, among the great apes and the lesser apes. I dwelt among the branches of the trees. I pounced upon the smaller prey and devoured it raw. With Korak and Hthi I hunted the antelope and the boar, and I sat upon a tree limb and made faces at Numa, the lion, and threw sticks at him and annoyed him until he roared so terribly in his rage that the earth shook. And Korak built me a lair high among the branches of a mighty tree. He brought me fruits and flesh. He fought for me and was kind to me until I came to Bwana, and my dear, I do not recall that any other than Korak was ever kind to me." There was a wistful note in the girl's voice now, and she had forgotten that she was bantering the Honourable Morrison. She was thinking of Korak. She had not thought of him a great deal of late. For a time both were silently absorbed in their own reflections as they rode on toward the bungalow of their host. The girl was thinking of a godlike figure, a leopard skin half concealing his smooth brown hide as he leaped nimbly through the trees to lay an offering of food before her on his return from a successful hunt. Behind him, shaggy and powerful, swung a huge anthropoid ape, while she, Miriam, laughing and shouting her welcome, swung upon a swaying limb before the entrance to her sylvan bower. It was a pretty picture as she recalled it. The other side seldom obtruded itself upon her memory: the long black nights, the chill, terrible jungle nights, the cold and damp and discomfort of the rainy season, the hideous mouthings of the savage carnivora as they prowled through the Stygian darkness beneath the constant menace of Sheeta, the panther and Hista, the snake, the stinging insects, the loathsome vermin, for in truth, all these had been outweighed by the happiness of the sunny days, the freedom of it all, and most, the companionship of Korak. The man's thoughts were rather jumbled. He had suddenly realized that he had come mighty near falling in love with this girl of whom he had known nothing up to the previous moment when she had voluntarily revealed a portion of her past to him. The more he thought upon the matter, the more evident it became to him that he had given her his love, that he had been upon the verge of offering her his honorable name. He trembled a little at the narrowness of his escape. Yet he still loved her. There was no objection to that according to the ethics of the Honorable Morrison Baines and his kind. She was a meaner clay than he. He could no more have taken her in marriage than he could have taken one of her baboon friends, nor would she of course expect such an offer from him. To have his love would be sufficient honor for her. His name he would naturally bestow upon one in his own elevated social sphere. A girl who had consorted with apes, who, according to her own admission, had lived almost naked among them, could have no considerable sense of the finer qualities of virtue. The love that he would offer her then would, far from offending her, probably cover all that she might desire or expect. The more the Honorable Morrison Baines thought upon the subject, the more fully convinced he became that he was contemplating a most chivalrous and unselfish act. Europeans will better understand his point of view than Americans, poor, benighted provincials, who are denied a true appreciation of caste and of the fact that the king can do no wrong. He did not even have to argue the point that she would be much happier amidst the luxuries of a London apartment, fortified as she would be by both his love and his bank account, than lawfully wed to such a one as her social position warranted. There was one question, however, which he wished to have definitely answered before he committed himself even to the program he was considering. Who were Korak and AHT, he asked. HT was a Mangani, replied Miriam, and Korak a Tarmangani. And what, pray, might a Mangani be in a Tarmangani? The girl laughed. You are a Tarmangani, she replied. The Mangani are covered with hair, you would call them apes. Then Korak was a white man, he asked. Yes. And he was your. He paused, for he found it rather difficult to go on with that line of questioning while the girl's clear, beautiful eyes were looking straight into his. What insisted Miriam, far too unsophisticated in her unspoiled innocence to guess what the Honorable Morrison was driving at. Why, your brother, he stumbled. No, Korak was not my brother, she replied. Was he your husband? Then he finally blurted. Far from taking offense, Miriam broke into a merry laugh. My husband, she cried. Why, how old do you think I am? I am too young to have a husband. I had never thought of such a thing. Korak was why. And now she hesitated too, for she never before had attempted to analyze the relationship that existed between herself and Korak. Why, Korak was just Korak, and again she broke into a gay laugh as she realized the illuminating quality of her description. Looking at her and listening to her, the man beside her could not believe that depravity of any sort or degree entered into the girl's nature. Yet he wanted to believe that she had not been virtuous, for otherwise his task was less a sinecure. The Honourable Morrison was not entirely without conscience. For several days the Honourable Morrison made no appreciable progress toward the consummation of his scheme. Sometimes he almost abandoned it, for he found himself time and again wondering how slight might be the provocation necessary to trick him into making a bona fide offer of marriage to Miriam if he permitted himself to fall more deeply in love with her. And it was difficult to see her daily and not love her. There was a quality about her which, all unknown to the Honourable Morrison, was making his task an extremely difficult one. It was that quality of innate goodness and cleanness which is a good girl's stoutest bulwark and protection, an impregnable barrier that only degeneracy has the effrontery to assail. The Honourable Morrison Baines would never be considered a degenerate. He was sitting with Miriam upon the veranda one evening after the others had retired. Earlier they had been playing tennis, a game in which the Honourable Morrison shone to advantage, as in truth he did in most all manly sports. He was telling Miriam stories of London and Paris, of balls and banquets, of the wonderful women and their wonderful gowns, of the pleasures and pastimes of the rich and powerful. The Honourable Morrison was a past master in the art of insidious boasting. His egotism was never flagrant or tiresome. He was never crude in it, for crudeness was a plebeianism that the Honourable Morrison studiously avoided. Yet the impression derived by a listener to the Honourable Morrison was one that was not at all calculated to detract from the glory of the House of Baines, or from that of its representative. Miriam was entranced. His tales were like fairy stories to this little jungle maid. The Honorable Morrison loomed large and wonderful and magnificent in her mind's eye. He fascinated her, and when he drew closer to her after a short silence, and took her hand, she thrilled as one might thrill beneath the touch of a deity, a thrill of exultation not unmixed with fear. He bent his lips close to her ear. "Miriam," he whispered, "my little Miriam, may I hope to have the right to call you my little Miriam?" The girl turned wide eyes upward to his face, but it was in shadow. She trembled, but she did not draw away. The man put an arm about her and drew her closer. "I love you," he whispered. She did not reply. She did not know what to say. She knew nothing of love. She had never given it a thought, but she did know that it was very nice to be loved, whatever it meant. It was nice to have people kind to one. She had known so little of kindness or affection. "Tell me," he said, "that you return my love." His lips came steadily closer to hers. They had almost touched when a vision of Korak sprang like a miracle before her eyes. She saw Korak's face close to hers. She felt his lips hot against hers, and then for the first time in her life she guessed what love meant. She drew away gently. "I am not sure," she said, "that I love you. Let us wait. There is plenty of time. I am too young to marry yet. And I am not sure that I should be happy in London or Paris. They rather frighten me." How easily and naturally she had connected his avowal of love with the idea of marriage. The Honorable Morrison was perfectly sure that he had not mentioned marriage. He had been particularly careful not to do so. And then she was not sure that she loved him. That, too, came rather in the nature of a shock to his vanity. It seemed incredible that this little barbarian should have any doubts whatever as to the desirability of the Honorable Morrison Baines. The first flush of passion cooled. The Honorable Morrison was enabled to reason more logically. The start had been all wrong. It would be better now to wait and prepare her mind gradually for the only proposition which his exalted estate would permit him to offer her. He would go slow. He glanced down at the girl's profile. It was bathed in the silvery light of the great tropic moon. The Honorable Morrison Baines wondered if it were to be so easy a matter to go slow. She was most alluring. Miriam rose. The vision of Korak was still before her. "Good night," she said. "It is almost too beautiful to leave." She waved her hand in a comprehensive gesture which took in the starry heavens, the great moon, the broad, silvered plain, and the dense shadows in the distance that marked the jungle. "Oh, how I love it." "You would love London more," he said earnestly, "and London would love you. You would be a famous beauty in any capital of Europe. You would have the world at your feet, Miriam." "Good night," she repeated, and left him. The Honorable Morrison selected a cigarette from his crested case, lighted it, blew a thin line of blue smoke toward the moon, and smiled. Chapter 18. Miriam and Bwana were sitting on the veranda together the following day when a horseman appeared in the distance riding across the plain toward the bungalow. Bwana shaded his eyes with his hand and gazed out toward the oncoming rider. He was puzzled. Strangers were few in Central Africa. Even the blacks, for a distance of many miles in every direction, were well known to him. No white man came within 100 miles that word of his coming did not reach Bwana long before the stranger. His every move was reported to the big Bwana, just what animals he killed and how many of each species, how he killed them too, for Bwana would not permit the use of prussic acid or strychnine, and how he treated his boys. Several European sportsmen had been turned back to the coast by the big Englishman's orders because of unwarranted cruelty to their black followers, and one, whose name had long been heralded in civilized communities as that of a great sportsman, was driven from Africa with orders never to return when Bwana found that his big bag of 14 lions had been made by the diligent use of poisoned bait. The result was that all good sportsmen and all the natives loved and respected him. His word was law where there had never been law before. There was scarce a headman from coast to coast who would not heed the big Bwana's commands in preference to those of the hunters who employed them, and so it was easy to turn back any undesirable stranger. Bwana had simply to threaten to order his boys to desert him. But there was evidently one who had slipped into the country unheralded. Bwana could not imagine who the approaching horseman might be. After the manner of frontier hospitality, the globe round, he met the newcomer at the gate, welcoming him even before he had dismounted. He saw a tall, well-knit man of 30 or over, blond of hair and smooth-shaven. There was a tantalizing familiarity about him that convinced Bwana that he should be able to call the visitor by name, yet he was unable to do so. The newcomer was evidently of Scandinavian origin. Both his appearance and accent denoted that. His manner was rough, but open. He made a good impression upon the Englishman, who was wont to accept strangers in this wild and savage country at their own valuation, asking no questions and assuming the best of them until they proved themselves undeserving of his friendship and hospitality. "It is rather unusual that a white man comes unheralded," he said, as they walked together toward the field into which he had suggested that the traveler might turn his pony. "My friends, the natives, keep us rather well posted." "It is probably due to the fact that I came from the south," explained the stranger, "that you did not hear of my coming. I have seen no village for several marches." "No, there are none to the south of us for many miles," replied Bwana. "Since Kovudu deserted his country, I rather doubt that one could find a native in that direction under 200 or 300 miles. Bwana was wondering how a lone white man could have made his way through the savage, unhospitable miles that lay toward the south. As though guessing what must be passing through the other's mind, the stranger vouchsafed an explanation. "I came down from the north to do a little trading and hunting," he said, "and got way off the beaten track. My head man, who was the only member of the safari who had ever before been in the country, took sick and died. We could find no natives to guide us. And so I simply swung back straight north. We have been living on the fruits of our guns for over a month. Didn't have an idea there was a white man within 1,000 miles of us when we camped last night by a waterhole at the edge of the plain. This morning I started out to hunt and saw the smoke from your chimney, so I sent my gun bearer back to camp with the good news and rode straight over here myself. Of course I've heard of you, everybody who comes into Central Africa does, and I'd be mighty glad of permission to rest up and hunt around here for a couple of weeks." "Certainly," replied Bwana. "Move your camp up close to the river below my boy's camp and make yourself at home." They had reached the veranda now, and Bwana was introducing the stranger to Miriam and my dear, who had just come from the bungalow's interior. "This is Mr. Hansen," he said, using the name the man had given him. "He is a trader who has lost his way in the jungle to the south." My dear and Miriam bowed their acknowledgments of the introduction. The man seemed rather ill at ease in their presence. His host attributed this to the fact that his guest was unaccustomed to the society of cultured women, and so found a pretext to quickly extricate him from his seemingly unpleasant position and lead him away to his study in the brandy and soda, which were evidently much less embarrassing to Mr. Hansen. When the two had left them, Miriam turned toward my dear. "It is odd," she said, "but I could almost swear that I had known Mr. Hansen in the past. It is odd, but quite impossible," and she gave the matter no further thought. Hansen did not accept Bwana's invitation to move his camp closer to the bungalow. He said his boys were inclined to be quarrelsome, and so were better off at a distance, and he himself was around but little, and then always avoided coming into contact with the ladies. A fact which naturally aroused only laughing comment on the rough trader's bashfulness. He accompanied the men on several hunting trips where they found him perfectly at home and well versed in all the finer points of big game hunting. Of an evening he often spent much time with the white foreman of the big farm, evidently finding in the society of this rougher man more common interests than the cultured guests of Bwana possessed for him. So it came that his was a familiar figure about the premises by night. He came and went as he saw fit, often wandering along in the great flower garden that was the especial pride and joy of my dear and Miriam. The first time that he had been surprised there, he apologized gruffly, explaining that he had always been fond of the good old blooms of northern Europe, which my dear had so successfully transplanted in African soil. Was it, though, the ever-beautiful blossoms of hollyhocks and phlox that drew him to the perfumed air of the garden, or that other infinitely more beautiful flower who wandered often among the blooms beneath the great moon, the black-haired, sun-tanned Matient? For 3 weeks Hansen had remained. During this time he said that his boys were resting and gaining strength after their terrible ordeals in the untracked jungle to the south, but he had not been as idle as he appeared to have been. He divided his small following into 2 parties, entrusting the leadership of each to men whom he believed that he could trust. To them he explained his plans and the rich reward that they would win from him if they carried his designs to a successful conclusion. One party he moved very slowly northward along the trail that connects with the great caravan routes entering the Sahara from the south. The other he ordered straight westward with orders to halt and go into permanent camp just beyond the great river which marks the natural boundary of the country that the big Bwana rightfully considers almost his own. To his host he explained that he was moving his safari slowly toward the north. He said nothing of the party moving westward. Then one day he announced that half his boys had deserted, for a hunting party from the bungalow had come across his northerly camp, and he feared that they might have noticed the reduced numbers of his following. And thus matters stood when, one hot night, Miriam, unable to sleep, rose and wandered out into the garden. The Honourable Morrison had been urging his suit once more that evening, and the girl's mind was in such a turmoil that she had been unable to sleep. The wide heavens about her seemed to promise a greater freedom from doubt and questioning. Baines had urged her to tell him that she loved him. A dozen times she thought that she might honestly give him the answer that he demanded. Corach Fast was becoming but a memory. That he was dead she had come to believe, since otherwise he would have sought her out. She did not know that he had even better reason to believe her dead, and that it was because of that belief he had made no effort to find her after his raid upon the village of Covidu. Behind a great flowering shrub Hansen lay gazing at the stars and waiting. He had lain thus and there many nights before. For what was he waiting, or for whom? He heard the girl approaching and half raised himself to his elbow. A dozen paces away, the reins looped over a fence post, stood his pony. Miriam, walking slowly, approached the bush behind which the waiter lay. Hansen drew a large bandana handkerchief from his pocket and rose stealthily to his knees. A pony neighed down at the corrals. Far out across the plain a lion roared. Hansen changed his position until he squatted upon both feet, ready to come erect quickly. Again the pony neighed, this time closer. There was the sound of his body brushing against shrubbery. Hansen heard and wondered how the animal had gotten from the corral, for it was evident that he was already in the garden. The man turned his head in the direction of the beast. What he saw sent him to the ground. Huddled close beneath the shrubbery a man was coming, leading 2 ponies. Miriam heard now and stopped to look and listen. A moment later the Honourable Morrison Baines drew near, the 2 saddled mounts at his heels. Miriam looked up at him in surprise. The Honourable Morrison grinned sheepishly. "I couldn't sleep," he explained, "and was going for a bit of a ride when I chanced to see you out here, and I thought you'd like to join me. Ripping good sport, you know, night riding. Come on." Miriam laughed. The adventure appealed to her. "All right," she said. Hansen swore beneath his breath. The 2 led their horses from the garden to the gate, and through it. There they discovered Hansen's mount. "Why, here's the trader's pony," remarked Baines. "He's probably down visiting with the foreman," said Miriam. "Pretty late for him, isn't it?" remarked the Honourable Morrison. "I'd hate to have to ride back through that jungle at night to his camp." As though to give weight to his apprehensions, the distant lion roared again. The Honourable Morrison shivered and glanced at the girl to note the effect of the uncanny sound upon her. She appeared not to have noticed it. A moment later the 2 had mounted and were moving slowly across the moon-bathed plain. The girl turned her pony's head straight toward the jungle. It was in the direction of the roaring of the hungry lion. "Hadn't we better steer clear of that fellow?" suggested the Honourable Morrison. "I guess you didn't hear him." "Yes, I heard him," laughed Miriam. "Let's ride over and call on him." The Honourable Morrison laughed uneasily. He didn't care to appear at a disadvantage before this girl, nor did he care either to approach a hungry lion too closely at night. He carried his rifle in his saddle boot, but moonlight is an uncertain light to shoot by, nor ever had he faced a lion alone even by day. The thought gave him a distinct nausea. The beast ceased his roaring now. They heard him no more, and the Honourable Morrison gained courage accordingly. They were riding downwind toward the jungle. The lion lay in a little swale to their right. He was old. For 2 nights he had not fed, for no longer was his charge as swift or his spring as mighty as in the days of his prime when he spread terror among the creatures of his wild domain. For 2 nights and days he had gone empty, and for a long time before that he had fed only upon carrion. He was old, but he was yet a terrible engine of destruction. At the edge of the forest the Honourable Morrison drew rein. He had no desire to go further. Numa, silent upon his padded feet, crept into the jungle beyond them. The wind, now, was blowing gently between him and his intended prey. He had come a long way in search of man, for even in his youth he had tasted human flesh, and while it was poor stuff by comparison with eland and zebra, it was less difficult to kill. In Numa's estimation man was a slow-witted, slow-footed creature which commanded no respect, unless accompanied by the acrid odor which spelled to the monarch's sensitive nostrils the great noise and the blinding flash of an express rifle. He caught the dangerous scent tonight, but he was ravenous to madness. He would face a dozen rifles, if necessary, to fill his empty belly. He circled about into the forest that he might again be downwind from his victims, for should they get his scent, he could not hope to overtake them. Numa was famished, but he was old and crafty. Deep in the jungle, another caught faintly the scent of man and of Numa both. He raised his head and sniffed. He cocked it upon one side and listened. "Come on," said Miriam. "Let's ride in a way. The forest is wonderful at night. It is open enough to permit us to ride." The Honorable Morrison hesitated. He shrank from revealing his fear in the presence of the girl. A braver man, sure of his own position, would have had the courage to have refused uselessly to expose the girl to danger. He would not have thought of himself at all, but the egotism of the Honorable Morrison required that he think always of self first. He had planned the ride to get Miriam away from the bungalow. He wanted to talk to her alone and far enough away so should she take offense at his purposed suggestion he would have time in which to attempt to right himself in her eyes before they reached home. He had little doubt, of course, but that he should succeed, but it is to his credit that he did have some slight doubts. "You needn't be afraid of the lion," said Miriam, noting his slight hesitancy. "There hasn't been a man-eater around here for 2 years, Bwana says, and the game is so plentiful that there is no necessity to drive Numa to human flesh. Then he has been so often hunted that he rather keeps out of man's way." "Oh, I'm not afraid of lions," replied the Honorable Morrison. "I was just thinking what a beastly uncomfortable place a forest is to ride in. What with the underbrush and the low branches and all that, it's not exactly cut out for pleasure riding." "Let's go afoot then," suggested Miriam, and started to dismount. "Oh no," cried the Honorable Morrison, aghast at this suggestion. "Let's ride," and he reined his pony into the dark shadows of the wood. Behind him came Miriam, and in front, prowling ahead, waiting a favorable opportunity, skulked Numa, the lion. Out upon the plain, a lone horseman muttered a low curse as he saw the two disappear from sight. It was Hansen. He had followed them from the bungalow. Their way led in the direction of his camp, so he had a ready and plausible excuse should they discover him, but they had not seen him, for they had not turned their eyes behind. Now he turned directly toward the spot at which they had entered the jungle. He no longer cared whether he was observed or not. There were 2 reasons for his indifference. The first was that he saw in Baines' act a counterpart of his own planned abduction of the girl. In some way he might turn the thing to his own purposes. At least he would keep in touch with them and make sure that Baines did not get her. His other reason was based on his knowledge of an event that had transpired at his camp the previous night, an event which he had not mentioned at the bungalow for fear of drawing undesired attention to his movements and bringing the blacks of the big Bwana into dangerous intercourse with his own boys. He had told at the bungalow that half his men had deserted. That story might be quickly disproved should his boys and Bwanas grow confidential. The event that he had failed to mention and which now urged him hurriedly after the girl and her escort had occurred during his absence early the preceding evening. His men had been sitting around their campfire, entirely encircled by a high thorn boma, when without the slightest warning, a huge lion had leaped amongst them and seized one of their number. It had been solely due to the loyalty and courage of his comrades that his life had been saved, and then only after a battle royal with the hunger-enraged beast had they been able to drive him off with burning brands, spears, and rifles. From this Hansen knew that a man-eater had wandered into the district or been developed by the aging of one of the many lions who ranged the plains and hills by night or lay up in the cool wood by day. He had heard the roaring of a hungry lion not half an hour before, and there was little doubt in his mind but that the man-eater was stalking Miriam and Baines. He cursed the Englishman for a fool and spurred rapidly after them. Miriam and Baines had drawn up in a small natural clearing. 100 yards beyond them, Numa lay crouching in the underbrush, his yellow-green eyes fixed upon his prey, the tip of his sinuous tail jerking spasmodically. He was measuring the distance between him and them. He was wondering if he dared venture a charge, or should he wait yet a little longer in the hope that they might ride straight into his jaws. He was very hungry, but also was he very crafty. He could not chance losing his meat by a hasty and ill-considered rush. Had he waited the night before until the blacks slept, he would not have been forced to go hungry for another 24 hours. Behind him the other that had caught his scent, and that of man together came to a sitting posture upon the branch of a tree in which he had reposed himself for slumber. Beneath him a lumbering grey hulk swayed to and fro in the darkness. The beast in the tree uttered a low guttural and dropped to the back of the grey mass. He whispered a word in one of the great ears, and Tantor, the elephant, raised his trunk aloft, swinging it high and low to catch the scent that the word had warned him of. There was another whispered word. Was it a command? And the lumbering beast wheeled into an awkward, yet silent shuffle in the direction of Numa, the lion, and the stranger Tarmangani his rider had scented. Onward they went, the scent of the lion and his prey becoming stronger and stronger. Numa was becoming impatient. How much longer must he wait for his meat to come his way? He lashed his tail viciously now. He almost growled. All unconscious of their danger, the man and the girl sat talking in the little clearing. Their horses were pressed side by side. Baines had found Miriam's hand and was pressing it as he poured words of love into her ear, and Miriam was listening. "Come to London with me," urged the Honourable Morrison. "I can gather a safari and we can be a whole day upon the way to the coast before they guess that we have gone." "Why must we go that way?" asked the girl. "Bwana and my dear would not object to our marriage." "I cannot marry you just yet," explained the Honourable Morrison. "There are some formalities to be attended to first. You do not understand. It will be all right. We will go to London. I cannot wait. If you love me, you will come. What of the apes you lived with? Did they bother about marriage? They love as we love. Had you stayed among them, you would have mated as they mate. It is the law of nature. No man-made law can abrogate the laws of God. What difference does it make if we love one another? What do we care for anyone in the world besides ourselves? I would give my life for you. Will you give nothing for me?" "You love me," she said. "You will marry me when we have reached London." "I swear it," he cried. "I will go with you," she whispered, "though I do not understand why it is necessary." She leaned toward him and he took her in his arms and bent to press his lips to hers. At the same instant, the head of a huge tusker poked through the trees that fringed the clearing. The Honourable Morrison and Miriam, with eyes and ears for one another alone, did not see or hear, but Numa did. The man upon Tantor's broad head saw the girl in the man's arms. It was Korak, but in the trim figure of the neatly garbed girl he did not recognize his Miriam. He only saw Tarmangani with his she. And then Numa charged. With a frightful roar, fearful lest Tantor had come to frighten away his prey, the great beast leaped from his hiding place. The earth trembled to his mighty voice. The ponies stood for an instant transfixed with terror. The Honourable Morrison Baines went white and cold. The lion was charging toward them full in the brilliant light of the magnificent moon. The muscles of the Honourable Morrison no longer obeyed his will. They flexed to the urge of a greater power, the power of nature's first law. They drove his spurred heels deep into his pony's flanks. They bore the rein against the brute's neck that wheeled him with an impetuous drive toward the plain and safety. The girl's pony, squealing in terror, reared and plunged upon the heels of his mate. The lion was close upon him. Only the girl was cool, the girl and the half-naked savage who bestrode the neck of his mighty mount and grinned at the exciting spectacle chance had staked for his enjoyment. To Korak here were but two strange Tarmangani pursued by Numa, who was empty. It was Numa's right to prey, but one was a she. Korak felt an intuitive urge to rush to her protection. Why, he could not guess. All Tarmangani were enemies now. He had lived too long a beast to feel strongly the humanitarian impulses that were inherent in him, yet feel them he did, for the girl at least. He urged Tantor forward. He raised his heavy spear and hurled it at the flying target of the lion's body. The girl's pony had reached the trees upon the opposite side of the clearing. Here he would become easy prey to the swiftly moving lion, but Numa, infuriated, preferred the woman upon his back. It was for her he leaped. Korak gave an exclamation of astonishment and approval as Numa landed upon the pony's rump, and at the same instant the girl swung free of her mount to the branches of a tree above her. Korak's spear struck Numa in the shoulder, knocking him from his precarious hold upon the frantically plunging horse. Freed of the weight of both girl and lion, the pony raced ahead towards safety. Numa tore and struck at the missile in his shoulder but could not dislodge it. Then he resumed the chase. Korak guided Tantor into the seclusion of the jungle. He did not wish to be seen, nor had he. Hansen had almost reached the wood when he heard the lion's terrific roars and knew that the charge had come. An instant later, the Honourable Morrison broke upon his vision, racing like mad for safety. The man lay flat upon his pony's back, hugging the animal's neck tightly with both arms and digging the spurs into his sides. An instant later, the second pony appeared riderless. Hansen groaned as he guessed what had happened out of sight in the jungle. With an oath, he spurred on in the hope of driving the lion from his prey. His rifle was ready in his hand. And then the lion came into view behind the girl's pony. Hansen could not understand. He knew that if Numa had succeeded in seizing the girl, he would not have continued in pursuit of the others. He drew in his own mount, took quick aim and fired. The lion stopped in his tracks, turned and bit at his side, then rolled over dead. Hansen rode on into the forest, calling aloud to the girl. "Here I am," came a quick response from the foliage of the trees just ahead. "Did you hit him?" "Yes," replied Hansen. "Where are you? You had a mighty narrow escape. It will teach you to keep out of the jungle at night." Together they returned to the plain, where they found the Honorable Morrison riding slowly back toward them. He explained that his pony had bolted and that he had had hard work stopping him at all. Hansen grinned, for he recalled the pounding heels that he had seen driving sharp spurs into the flanks of Bain's mount, but he said nothing of what he had seen. He took Miriam up behind him, and the three rode in silence toward the bungalow. Chapter 19. Behind them, Korak emerged from the jungle and recovered his spear from Numa's side. He still was smiling. He had enjoyed the spectacle exceedingly. There was one thing that troubled him: the agility with which the she had clambered from her pony's back into the safety of the tree above her. That was more like Mangani, more like his lost Miriam. He sighed. His lost Miriam, his little dead Miriam. He wondered if this she stranger resembled his Miriam in other ways. A great longing to see her overwhelmed him. He looked after the three figures moving steadily across the plain. He wondered where might lie their destination. A desire to follow them came over him, but he only stood there watching until they had disappeared in the distance. The sight of the civilized girl and the dapper, khaki-clad Englishman had aroused in Korak memories long dormant. Once he had dreamed of returning to the world of such as these, but with the death of Miriam, hope and ambition seemed to have deserted him. He cared now only to pass the remainder of his life in solitude, as far from man as possible. With a sigh, he turned slowly back into the jungle. Tantor, nervous by nature, had been far from reassured by close proximity to the three strange whites, and with the report of Hansen's rifle had turned and ambled away at his long, swinging shuffle. He was nowhere in sight when Korak returned to look for him. The ape-man, however, was little concerned by the absence of his friend. Tantor had a habit of wandering off unexpectedly. For a month they might not see one another, for Korak seldom took the trouble to follow the great pachyderm, nor did he upon this occasion. Instead, he found a comfortable perch in a large tree and was soon asleep. At the bungalow, Bwana had met the returning adventurers on the veranda. In a moment of wakefulness, he had heard the report of Hansen's rifle far out across the plain, and wondered what it might mean. Presently it had occurred to him that the man whom he considered in the light of a guest might have met with an accident on his way back to camp. So he had arisen and gone to his foreman's quarters, where he had learned that Hansen had been there earlier in the evening but had departed several hours before. Returning from the foreman's quarters, Bwana had noticed that the corral gate was open, and further investigation revealed the fact that Miriam's pony was gone, and also the one most often used by Baines. Instantly Bwana assumed that the shot had been fired by Honorable Morrison, and had again aroused his foreman and was making preparations to set forth an investigation when he had seen the party approaching across the plain. No explanation on the part of the Englishman met a rather chilly reception from his host. Miriam was silent. She saw that Bwana was angry with her. It was the first time, and she was heartbroken. "Go to your room, Miriam," he said, "and Baines, if you will step into my study, I'd like to have a word with you in a moment." He stepped toward Hansen as the others turned to obey him. There was something about Bwana, even in his gentlest moods, that commanded instant obedience. "How did you happen to be with them, Hansen?" he asked. "I'd been sitting in the garden," replied the trader after leaving Jervis' quarters. "I have a habit of doing that, as your lady probably knows. Tonight I fell asleep behind a bush and was awakened by them two spooning. I couldn't hear what they said. But presently Baines brings two ponies and they ride off. I didn't like to interfere, for it wasn't any of my business, but I knew they hadn't ought to be riding about that time of night. The leastways not the girl, it wasn't right and it wasn't safe. So I follows them, and it's just as well I did. Baines was getting away from the lion as fast as he could, leaving the girl to take care of herself, when I got a lucky shot into the beast's shoulder that fixed him." Hansen paused. Both men were silent for a time. Presently the trader coughed in an embarrassed manner, as though there was something on his mind he felt in duty bound to say, but hated to. "What is it?" Hansen asked Bwana. "You were about to say something, weren't you?" "Well, you see, it's like this," ventured Hansen. "Been around here evenings a good deal. I've seen them two together a lot. And, begging your pardon, sir, but I don't think Mr. Baines means the girl any good. I've overheard enough to make me think he's trying to get her to run off with him. Hansen, to fit his own ends, hit nearer the truth than he knew. He was afraid that Baines would interfere with his own plans, and he had hit upon a scheme to both utilize the young Englishman and get rid of him at the same time. And I thought, continued the trader, that inasmuch as I'm about due to move, you might like to suggest to Mr. Baines that he go with me. I'd be willing to take him north to the caravan trails as a favor to you, sir. Bwana stood in deep thought for a moment. Presently he looked up. Of course, Hansen, Mr. Baines is my guest, he said, a grim twinkle in his eye. Really, I cannot accuse him of planning to run away with Miriam on the evidence that we have, and as he is my guest, I should hate to be so discourteous as to ask him to leave, but, if I recall his words correctly, it seems to me that he has spoken of returning home. And I am sure that nothing would delight him more than going north with you. You say you start tomorrow. I think Mr. Baines will accompany you. Drop over in the morning, if you please, and now good night, and thank you for keeping a watchful eye on Miriam. Hansen hid a grin as he turned and sought his saddle. Bwana stepped from the veranda to his study, where he found the Honourable Morrison pacing back and forth, evidently very ill at ease. Baines, said Bwana, coming directly to the point, Hansen is leaving for the north tomorrow. He has taken a great fancy to you, and just asked me to say to you that he'd be glad to have you accompany him. Good night, Baines. At Bwana's suggestion, Miriam kept to her room the following morning until after the Honourable Morrison Baines had departed. Hansen had come for him early. In fact, he had remained all night with the foreman Jervis that they might get an early start. The farewell exchanges between the Honourable Morrison and his host were of the most formal type, and when at last the guest rode away, Bwana breathed a sigh of relief. It had been an unpleasant duty, and he was glad that it was over, but he did not regret his action. He had not been blind to Baines' infatuation for Miriam, and knowing the young man's pride in caste, he had never for a moment believed that his guest would offer his name to this nameless Arab girl, for extremely light in colour, though she was for a full-blood Arab, Bwana believed her to be such. He did not mention the subject again to Miriam, and in this he made a mistake, for the young girl, while realizing the debt of gratitude she owed Bwana and my dear, was both proud and sensitive. So that Bwana's action in sending Baines away and giving her no opportunity to explain or defend hurt and mortified her. Also, it did much toward making a martyr of Baines in her eyes and arousing in her breast a keen feeling of loyalty toward him. What she had half mistaken for love before, she now wholly mistook for love. Bwana and my dear might have told her much of the social barriers that they only too well knew Baines must feel existed between Miriam and himself, but they hesitated to wound her. It would have been better had they inflicted this lesser sorrow and saved the child the misery that was to follow because of her ignorance. As Hansen and Baines rode toward the former's camp, the Englishman maintained a morose silence. The other was attempting to formulate an opening that would lead naturally to the proposition he had in mind. He rode a neck behind his companion, grinning as he noted the sullen scowl upon the other's patrician face. Rather rough on you, wasn't he? He ventured at last, jerking his head back in the direction of the bungalow as Baines turned his eyes upon him at the remark. He thinks a lot of the girl. Continued Hansen, and don't want nobody to marry her and take her away, but it looks to me as though he was doing her more harm than good in sending you away. She ought to marry some time, and she couldn't do better than a fine young gentleman like you. Baines, who had at first felt inclined to take offence at the mention of his private affairs by this common fellow, was mollified by Hansen's final remark, and immediately commenced to see in him a man of fine discrimination. He's a darned bounder, grumbled the Honourable Morrison, but I'll get even with him. He may be the whole thing in Central Africa, but I'm as big as he is in London, and he'll find it out when he comes home. If I was you, said Hansen, I wouldn't let any man keep me from getting the girl I want. Between you and me, I ain't got no use for him either, and if I can help you anyway, just call on me. It's mighty good of you, Hansen, replied Baines, warming up a bit, but what can a fellow do here in this god-forsaken hole? I know what I'd do, said Hansen. I'd take the girl along with me. If she loves you, she'll go, all right. It can't be done, said Baines. He bosses this whole blooming country for miles around. He'd be sure to catch us. No, he wouldn't. Not with me running things, said Hansen. I've been trading and hunting here for 10 years, and I know as much about the country as he does. If you want to take the girl along, I'll help you, and I'll guarantee that there won't nobody catch up with us before we reach the coast. I'll tell you what. You write her a note, and I'll get it to her by my head man. Ask her to meet you to say goodbye. She won't refuse that. In the meantime, we can be moving camp a little further north all the time, and you can make arrangements with her to be all ready on a certain night. Tell her I'll meet her then. While you wait for us in camp. That'll be better, for I know the country well and can cover it quicker than you. You can take care of the safari and be moving along slow toward the north and the girl, and I'll catch up to you. But suppose she won't come, suggested Baines. Then make another date for a last goodbye, said Hansen, and instead of you I'll be there and I'll bring her along anyway. She'll have to come, and after it's all over she won't feel so bad about it, especially after living with you for 2 months while we're making the coast. A shocked and angry protest rose to Baines' lips, but he did not utter it, for almost simultaneously came the realization that this was practically the same thing he had been planning upon himself. It had sounded brutal and criminal from the lips of the rough trader. But nevertheless, the young Englishman saw that with Hansen's help and his knowledge of African travel, the possibilities of success would be much greater than as though the Honourable Morrison were to attempt the thing single-handed. And so he nodded a glum assent. The balance of the long ride to Hansen's northerly camp was made in silence, for both men were occupied with their own thoughts, most of which were far from being either complimentary or loyal to the other. As they rode through the wood, the sounds of their careless passage came to the ears of another jungle wayfarer. The killer had determined to come back to the place where he had seen the white girl who took to the trees with the ability of long habitude. There was a compelling something in the recollection of her that drew him irresistibly toward her. He wished to see her by the light of day, to see her features, to see the color of her eyes and hair. It seemed to him that she must bear a strong resemblance to his lost Miriam, and yet he knew that the chances were that she did not. The fleeting glimpse that he had had of her in the moonlight, as she swung from the back of her plunging pony into the branches of the tree above her, had shown him a girl of about the same height as his Miriam, but of a more rounded and developed femininity. Now he was moving lazily back in the direction of the spot where he had seen the girl when the sounds of the approaching horsemen came to his sharp ears. He moved stealthily through the branches until he came within sight of the riders. The younger man he instantly recognized as the same he had seen with his arms about the girl in the moonlit glade just the instant before Numa charged. The other he did not recognize, though there was a familiarity about his carriage and figure that puzzled Korak. The ape-man decided that to find the girl again he would but have to keep in touch with the young Englishman, and so he fell in behind the pair, following them to Hansen's camp. Here the Honourable Morrison penned a brief note, which Hansen gave into the keeping of one of his boys, who started off forthwith toward the south. Korak remained in the vicinity of the camp, keeping a careful watch upon the Englishman. He had half expected to find the girl at the destination of the 2 riders, and had been disappointed when no sign of her materialized about the camp. Baines was restless, pacing back and forth beneath the trees when he should have been resting against the forced marches of the coming flight. Hansen lay in his hammock and smoked. They spoke but little. Korak lay stretched upon a branch among the dense foliage above them. Thus passed the balance of the afternoon. Korak became hungry and thirsty. He doubted that either of the men would leave camp now before morning, so he withdrew but toward the south, for there it seemed most likely the girl still was. In the garden beside the bungalow, Miriam wandered thoughtfully in the moonlight. She still smarted from Bwana's, to her, unjust treatment of the Honourable Morrison Baines. Nothing had been explained to her, for both Bwana and my dear had wished to spare her the mortification and sorrow of the true explanation of Baines' proposal. They knew, as Miriam did not, that the man had no intention of marrying her, else he would have come directly to Bwana, knowing full well that no objection would be interposed if Miriam really cared for him. Miriam loved them both, and was grateful to them for all that they had done for her, but deep in her little heart surged the savage love of liberty that her years of untrammeled freedom in the jungle had made part and parcel of her being. Now, for the first time since she had come to them, Miriam felt like a prisoner in the bungalow of Bwana and my dear. Like a caged tigress, the girl paced the length of the enclosure. Once she paused near the outer fence, her head upon one side, listening. What was it she had heard? The pad of naked human feet, just beyond the garden. She listened for a moment. The sound was not repeated. Then she resumed her restless walking. Down to the opposite end of the garden she passed, turned and retraced her steps toward the upper end. Upon the sward near the bushes that hid the fence, full in the glare of the moonlight, lay a white envelope that had not been there when she had turned almost upon the very spot a moment before. Miriam stopped short in her tracks, listening again and sniffing more than ever, the tigress alert, ready. Beyond the bushes a naked black runner squatted, peering through the foliage. he saw her take a step closer to the letter. She had seen it. He rose quietly, and following the shadows of the bushes that ran down to the corral, was soon gone from sight. Miriam's trained ears heard his every move. She made no attempt to seek closer knowledge of his identity. Already she had guessed that he was a messenger from the Honorable Morrison. She stooped and picked up the envelope. Tearing it open, she easily read the contents by the moon's brilliant light. It was, as she had guessed, from Baines. "I cannot go without seeing you again," it read. "Come to the clearing early tomorrow morning and say goodbye to me. Come alone." There was a little more words that made her heart beat faster and a happy flush mount her cheek. Chapter 20. It was still dark when the Honorable Morrison Baines set forth for the trysting place. He insisted upon having a guide, saying that he was not sure that he could find his way back to the little clearing. As a matter of fact, the thought of that lonely ride through the darkness before the sun rose had been too much for his courage, and he craved company. A black, therefore, preceded him on foot. Behind and above him came Korak, whom the noise in the camp had awakened. It was 9 o'clock before Baines drew rein in the clearing. Miriam had not yet arrived. The black lay down to rest. Baines lolled in his saddle. Korak stretched himself comfortably upon a lofty limb, where he could watch those beneath him without being seen. An hour passed. Baines gave evidence of nervousness. Korak had already guessed that the young Englishman had come here to meet another, nor was he at all in doubt as to the identity of that other. The killer was perfectly satisfied that he was soon again to see the nimble she who had so forcefully reminded him of Miriam. Presently the sound of an approaching horse came to Korak's ears. She was coming. She had almost reached the clearing before Baines became aware of her presence, and then as he looked up, the foliage parted to the head and shoulders of her mount, and Miriam rode into view. Baines spurred to meet her. Korak looked searchingly down upon her, mentally anathematizing the broad-brimmed hat that hid her features from his eyes. She was abreast the Englishman now. Korak saw the man take both her hands and draw her close to his breast. He saw the man's face concealed for a moment beneath the same broad brim that hid the girl's. He could imagine their lips meeting, and a twinge of sorrow and sweet recollection combined to close his eyes for an instant in that involuntary muscular act with which we attempt to shut out from the mind's eye harrowing reflections. When he looked again, they had drawn apart and were conversing earnestly. Korak could see the man urging something. It was equally evident that the girl was holding back. There were many of her gestures and the way in which she tossed her head up and to the right, tilting her chin, that reminded Korak still more strongly of Miriam. And then the conversation was over, and the man took the girl in his arms again to kiss her goodbye. She turned and rode toward the point from which she had come. The man sat on his horse, watching her. At the edge of the jungle, she turned to wave him a final farewell. "Tonight," she cried, throwing back her head as she called the words to him across the little distance which separated them, throwing back her head and revealing her face for the first time to the eyes of the killer in the tree above. Korak started as though pierced through the heart with an arrow. He trembled and shook like a leaf. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms across them, and then he opened them again and looked, but the girl was gone. Only the waving foliage of the jungle's rim marked where she had disappeared. It was impossible. It could not be true. And yet, with his own eyes, he had seen his Miriam older a little, with figure more rounded by nearer maturity, and subtly changed in other ways more beautiful than ever, yet still his little Miriam. Yes, he had seen the dead alive again. He had seen his Miriam in the flesh. She lived. She had not died. He had seen her. He had seen his Miriam in the arms of another man, and that man sat below him now, within easy reach. Korak, the killer, fondled his heavy spear. He played with the grass rope dangling from his G-string. He stroked the hunting knife at his hip. And the man beneath him called to his drowsy guide, bent the rein to his pony's neck, and moved off toward the north. Still sat Korak, the killer, alone among the trees. Now his hands hung idly at his sides. His weapons and what he had intended were forgotten for the moment. Korak was thinking. He had noted that subtle change in Miriam. When last he had seen her, she had been his little, half-naked Mangani, wild, savage, and uncouth. She had not seemed uncouth to him then, but now, in the change that had come over her, he knew that such she had been, yet no more uncouth than he, and he was still uncouth. In her had taken place the change. In her he had just seen a sweet and lovely flower of refinement and civilization, and he shuddered as he recalled the fate that he himself had planned for her, to be the mate of an aped man, his mate, in the savage jungle. Then he had seen no wrong in it, for he had loved her, and the way he had planned had been the way of the jungle which they two had chosen as their home. But now, after having seen the Miriam of civilized attire, he realized the hideousness of his once cherished plan. And he thanked God that chance and the blacks of Kovudu had thwarted him. Yet he still loved her, and jealousy seared his soul as he recalled the sight of her in the arms of the dapper young Englishman. What were his intentions toward her? Did he really love her? How could one not love her? And she loved him, of that Korak had had ample proof. Had she not loved him, she would not have accepted his kisses. His Miriam loved another. For a long time he let that awful truth sink deep, and from it he tried to reason out his future plan of action. In his heart was a great desire to follow the man and slay him, but ever there rose in his consciousness the thought, she loves him. Could he slay the creature Miriam loved? Sadly he shook his head. No, he could not. Then came a partial decision to follow Miriam and speak with her. He half started, and then glanced down at his nakedness and was ashamed. He, the son of a British peer, had thus thrown away his life, had thus degraded himself to the level of a beast, that he was ashamed to go to the woman he loved and lay his love at her feet. He was ashamed to go to the little Arab maid who had been his jungle playmate, for what had he to offer her? For years circumstances had prevented a return to his father and mother, and at last pride had stepped in and expunged from his mind the last vestige of any intention to return. In a spirit of boyish adventure he had cast his lot with the jungle ape. The killing of the crook in the Coast Inn had filled his childish mind with terror of the law and driven him deeper into the wilds. The rebuffs that he had met at the hands of men, both black and white, had had their effect upon his mind while yet it was in a formative state and easily influenced. He had come to believe that the hand of man was against him, and then he had found in Miriam the only human association he required or craved. When she had been snatched from him, his sorrow had been so deep that the thought of ever mingling again with human beings grew still more unutterably distasteful. Finally, and for all time, he thought the die was cast. Of his own volition he had become a beast he had lived, a beast he would die. Now that it was too late, he regretted it. For now Miriam, still living, had been revealed to him in a guise of progress and advancement that had carried her completely out of his life. Death itself could not have further removed her from him. In her new world she loved a man of her own kind. And Korak knew that it was right. She was not for him, not for the naked savage ape. No, she was not for him, but he still was hers. If he could not have her in happiness, he would at least do all that lay in his power to assure happiness to her. He would follow the young Englishman. In the first place, he would know that he meant Miriam no harm, and after that, though jealousy wrenched his heart, he would watch over the man Miriam loved, for Miriam's sake, but God help that man if he thought to wrong her. Slowly he aroused himself. He stood erect and stretched his great frame, the muscles of his arms gliding sinuously beneath his tanned skin as he bent his clenched fists behind his head. A movement on the ground beneath caught his eye. An antelope was entering the clearing. Immediately Korak became aware that he was empty again. He was a beast. For a moment love had lifted him to sublime heights of honor and renunciation. The antelope was crossing the clearing. Korak dropped to the ground upon the opposite side of the tree, and so lightly that not even the sensitive ears of the antelope apprehended his presence. He uncoiled his grass rope. It was the latest addition to his armament, yet he was proficient with it. Often he traveled with nothing more than his knife and his rope. They were light and easy to carry. His spear and bow and arrows were cumbersome, and he usually kept one or all of them hidden away in a private cache. Now he held a single coil of the long rope in his right hand and the balance in his left. The antelope was but a few paces from him. Silently Korak leaped from his hiding place, swinging the rope free from the entangling shrubbery. The antelope sprang away almost instantly, but instantly too the coiled rope, with its sliding noose, flew through the air above him. With unerring precision it settled about the creature's neck. There was a quick wrist movement of the thrower. The noose tightened. The killer braced himself with the rope across his hip, and as the antelope tautened the singing strands in a last frantic bound for liberty, he was thrown over upon his back. Then, instead of approaching the fallen animal as a roper of the western plains might do, Korak dragged his captive to himself, pulling him in hand over hand, and when he was within reach, leaping upon him even as Sheeta the panther might have done, and burying his teeth in the animal's neck, while he found its heart with the point of his hunting knife. Recoiling his rope, he cut a few generous strips from his kill and took to the trees again, where he ate in peace. Later he swung off in the direction of a nearby water hole, and then he slept. In his mind, of course, was the suggestion of another meeting between Miriam and the young Englishman that had been borne to him by the girl's parting tonight. He had not followed Miriam because he knew from the direction from which she had come and in which she returned that wheresoever she had found an asylum it lay out across the plains, and not wishing to be discovered by the girl he had not cared to venture into the open after her. It would do as well to keep in touch with the young man, and that was precisely what he intended doing. To you or me, the possibility of locating the Honourable Morrison in the jungle after having permitted him to get such a considerable start might have seemed remote, but to Korak it was not at all so. He guessed that the white man would return to his camp, but should he have done otherwise, it would be a simple matter to the killer to trail a mounted man accompanied by another on foot. Days might pass, and still such a spoor would be sufficiently plain to lead Korak unfalteringly to its end, while a matter of a few hours only left it as clear to him as though the makers themselves were still in plain sight. And so it came that a few minutes after the Honourable Morrison Baines entered the camp to be greeted by Hansen, Korak slipped noiselessly into a nearby tree. There he lay until late afternoon, and still the young Englishman made no move to leave camp. Korak wondered if Miriam were coming there. A little later, Hansen and one of his black boys rode out of camp. Korak merely noted the fact. He was not particularly interested in what any other member of the company than the young Englishman did. Darkness came, and still the young man remained. He ate his evening meal, afterward smoking numerous cigarettes. Presently he began to pace back and forth before his tent. He kept his boy busy replenishing the fire. A lion coughed, and he went into his tent to reappear with an express rifle. Again he admonished the boy to throw more brush upon the fire. Korak saw that he was nervous and afraid, and his lip curled in a sneer of contempt. Was this the creature who had supplanted him in the heart of his Miriam? Was this a man who trembled when Numa coughed? How could such as he protect Miriam from the countless dangers of the jungle? But he would not have to. They would live in the safety of European civilization, where men in uniforms were hired to protect them. What need had a European of prowess to protect his mate? Again the sneer curled Korak's lip. Hansen and his boy had ridden directly to the clearing. It was already dark when they arrived. Leaving the boy there, Hansen rode to the edge of the plain, leading the boy's horse. There he waited. It was 9 o'clock before he saw a solitary figure galloping toward him from the direction of the bungalow. A few moments later, Miriam drew in her mount beside him. She was nervous and flushed. When she recognized Hansen, she drew back, startled. Mr. Baines' horse fell on him and sprained his ankle. Hansen hastened to explain. He couldn't very well come, so he sent me to meet you and bring you to camp. The girl could not see in the darkness the gloating, triumphant expression on the speaker's face. We had better hurry, continued Hansen, for we'll have to move along pretty fast if we don't want to be overtaken. Is he hurt badly? asked Miriam. Only a little sprain, replied Hansen. He can ride all right, but we both thought he'd better lie up tonight and rest, for he'll have plenty hard riding in the next few weeks. Yes, agreed the girl. Hansen swung his pony about and Miriam followed him. They rode north along the edge of the jungle for a mile and then turned straight into it toward the west. Miriam, following, paid little attention to directions. She did not know exactly where Hansen's camp lay, and so she did not guess that he was not leading her toward it. All night they rode, straight toward the west. When morning came, Hansen permitted a short halt for breakfast, which he had provided in well-filled saddlebags before leaving his camp. Then they pushed on again, nor did they halt a second time, until in the heat of the day he stopped and motioned the girl to dismount. We will sleep here for a time and let the ponies graze, he said. I had no idea the camp was so far away, said Miriam. I left orders that they were to move on at daybreak, explained the trader, so that we could get a good start. I knew that you and I could easily overtake a laden safari. It may not be until tomorrow that we'll catch up with them. But though they traveled part of the night and all of the following day, no sign of the safari appeared ahead of them. Miriam, an adept in jungle craft, knew that none had passed ahead of them for many days. Occasionally she saw indications of an old spoor, a very old spoor of many men. For the most part they followed this well-marked trail along elephant paths and through park-like groves. It was an ideal trail for rapid traveling. Miriam at last became suspicious. Gradually the attitude of the man at her side had begun to change. Often she surprised him devouring her with his eyes. Steadily the former sensation of previous acquaintanceship urged itself upon her. Somewhere, sometime before she had known this man, it was evident that he had not shaved for several days. A blonde stubble had commenced to cover his neck and cheeks and chin, and with it the assurance that he was no stranger continued to grow upon the girl. It was not until the second day, however, that Miriam rebelled. She drew in her pony at last and voiced her doubts. Hansen assured her that the camp was but a few miles further on. "We should have overtaken them yesterday," he said. "They must have marched much faster than I had believed possible." "They have not marched here at all," said Miriam. "The spoor that we have been following is weeks old." Hansen laughed. "Oh, that's it. Is it?" he cried. "Why didn't you say so before? I could have easily explained. We are not coming by the same route, but we'll pick up their trail sometime today, even if we don't overtake them." Now, at last, Miriam knew the man was lying to her. What a fool he must be to think that anyone could believe such a ridiculous explanation. Who was so stupid as to believe that they could have expected to overtake another party, and he had certainly assured her that momentarily he expected to do so when that party's route was not to meet theirs for several miles yet. She kept her own counsel, however, planning to escape at the first opportunity when she might have a sufficient start of her captor, as she now considered him, to give her some assurance of outdistancing him. She watched his face continually when she could without being observed. Tantalizingly, the placing of his familiar features persisted in eluding her. Where had she known him? Under what conditions had they met before she had seen him about the farm of Buana? She ran over in her mind all the few white men she ever had known. There were some who had come to her father's douar in the jungle. Few, it is true, but there had been some. Now she had it. She had seen him there. She almost seized upon his identity, and then in an instant it had slipped from her again. It was mid-afternoon when they suddenly broke out of the jungle upon the banks of a broad and placid river. Beyond, upon the opposite shore, Miriam described a camp surrounded by a high thorn boma. "Here we are at last," said Hansen. He drew his revolver and fired in the air. Instantly the camp across the river was astir. Black men ran down the river's bank. Hansen hailed them, but there was no sign of the Honourable Morrison Baines. In accordance with their master's instructions, the blacks manned a canoe and rowed across. Hansen placed Miriam in the little craft and entered it himself, leaving 2 boys to watch the horses, which the canoe was to return for and swim across to the campside of the river. Once in the camp, Miriam asked for Baines. For the moment her fears had been allayed by the sight of the camp, which she had come to look upon as more or less a myth. Hansen pointed toward the single tent that stood in the center of the enclosure. "There," he said, and preceded her toward it. At the entrance he held the flap aside and motioned her within. Miriam entered and looked about. The tent was empty. She turned toward Hansen. There was a broad grin on his face. "Where is Mr. Baines?" she demanded. "He ain't here," replied Hansen. "Leastwise, I don't see him, do you? But I'm here, and I'm a damned sight better man than that thing ever was. You don't need him no more, you got me," and he laughed uproariously and reached for her. Miriam struggled to free herself. Hansen encircled her arms and body in his powerful grip and bore her slowly backward toward the pile of blankets at the far end of the tent. His face was bent close to hers. His eyes were narrowed to 2 slits of heat and passion and desire. Miriam was looking full into his face as she fought for freedom when there came over her a sudden recollection of a similar scene in which she had been a participant, and with it full recognition of her assailant. He was the Swede Malbien who had attacked her once before, who had shot his companion who would have saved her, and from whom she had been rescued by Buana. His smooth face had deceived her, but now, with the growing beard and the similarity of conditions, recognition came swift and sure. But today there would be no Buana to save her. Chapter 21. The black boy whom Malbien had left awaiting him in the clearing with instructions to remain until he returned sat crouched at the foot of a tree for an hour when he was suddenly startled by the coughing grunt of a lion behind him. With celerity born of the fear of death, the boy clambered into the branches of the tree, and a moment later the king of beasts entered the clearing and approached the carcass of an antelope which, until now, the boy had not seen. Until daylight the beast fed, while the black clung, sleepless, to his perch, wondering what had become of his master and the 2 ponies. He had been with Malbien for a year, and so was fairly conversant with the character of the white. His knowledge presently led him to believe that he had been purposely abandoned. Like the balance of Malbien's followers, this boy hated his master cordially, fear being the only bond that held him to the white man. His present uncomfortable predicament but added fuel to the fires of his hatred. As the sun rose, the lion withdrew into the jungle, and the black descended from his tree and started upon his long journey back to camp. In his primitive brain revolved various fiendish plans for a revenge that he would not have the courage to put into effect when the test came and he stood face to face with one of the dominant race. A mile from the clearing, he came upon the spoor of two ponies crossing his path at right angles. A cunning look entered the black's eyes. He laughed uproariously and slapped his thighs. Negroes are tireless gossipers, which of course is but a roundabout way of saying that they are human. Malbian's boys had been no exception to the rule, and as many of them had been with him at various times during the past 10 years, there was little about his acts and life in the African wilds that was not known directly or by hearsay to them all. And so, knowing his master and many of his past deeds, knowing, too, a great deal about the plans of Malbian and Baines that had been overheard by himself or other servants, and knowing well from the gossip of the head men that half of Malbian's party lay in camp by the great river far to the west, it was not difficult for the boy to put 2 and 2 together and arrive at 4, as the sum the 4 being represented by a firm conviction that his master had deceived the other white man and taken the latter's woman to his western camp, leaving the other to suffer capture and punishment at the hands of the big Bwana whom all feared. Again the boy bared his rows of big white teeth and laughed aloud. Then he resumed his northward way, travelling at a dogged trot that ate up the miles with marvellous rapidity. In the Swedes' camp, the Honourable Morrison had spent an almost sleepless night of nervous apprehension and doubts and fears. Toward morning he had slept, utterly exhausted. It was the headman who awoke him shortly after sunrise to remind him that they must at once take up their northward journey. Baines hung back. He wanted to wait for Hansen and Miriam. The headman urged upon him the danger that lay in loitering. The fellow knew his master's plans sufficiently well to understand that he had done something to arouse the ire of the big Bwana, and that it would fare ill with them all if they were overtaken in Big Bwana's country. At the suggestion, Baines took alarm. What if the Big Bwana, as the headman called him, had surprised Hansen in his nefarious work? Would he not guess the truth and possibly be already on the march to overtake and punish him? Baines had heard much of his host's summary method of dealing out punishment to malefactors great and small who transgressed the laws or customs of his savage little world, which lay beyond the outer ramparts of what men are pleased to call frontiers. In this savage world, where there was no law, the big Bwana was law unto himself and all who dwelt about him. It was even rumored that he had extracted the death penalty from a white man who had maltreated a native girl. Baines shuddered at the recollection of this piece of gossip as he wondered what his host would exact of the man who had attempted to steal his young white ward. The thought brought him to his feet. "Yes," he said nervously, "we must get away from here at once. Do you know the trail to the north?" The headman did, and he lost no time in getting the safari upon the march. It was noon when a tired and sweat-covered runner overtook the trudging little column. The man was greeted with shouts of welcome from his fellows, to whom he imparted all that he knew and guessed of the actions of their master, so that the entire safari was aware of matters before Baines, who marched close to the head of the column, was reached and acquainted with the facts and the imaginings of the black boy whom Malbian had deserted in the clearing the night before. When the Honourable Morrison had listened to all that the boy had to say and realized that the traitor had used him as a tool whereby he himself might get Miriam into his possession, his blood ran hot with rage and he trembled with apprehension for the girl's safety. That another contemplated no worse a deed than he had contemplated in no way palliated the hideousness of the other's offence. At first it did not occur to him that he would have wronged Miriam no less than he believed Hansen contemplated wronging her. Now his rage was more the rage of a man beaten at his own game and robbed of the prize that he had thought already his. "Do you know where your master has gone?" he asked the black. "Yes, Bwana," replied the boy. "He has gone to the other camp beside the big Afi that flows far toward the setting sun." "Can you take me to him?" demanded Baines. The boy nodded affirmatively. Here he saw a method of revenging himself upon his hated Bwana, and at the same time of escaping the wrath of the big Bwana whom all were positive would first follow after the northerly safari. "Can you and I alone reach his camp?" asked the Honourable Morrison. "Yes," Bwana assured the black. Baines turned toward the headman. He was conversant with Hansen's plans now. He understood why he had wished to move the northern camp as far as possible toward the northern boundary of the Big Bwana's country. It would give him far more time to make his escape toward the west coast while the Big Bwana was chasing the northern contingent. Well, he would utilize the man's plans to his own end. He, too, must keep out of the clutches of his host. "You may take the men north as fast as possible," he said to the headman. "I shall return and attempt to lead the big Bwana to the west." The Negro assented with a grunt. He had no desire to follow this strange white man who was afraid at night. He had less to remain at the tender mercies of the big Bwana's lusty warriors, between whom and his people there was long-standing blood feud, and he was more than delighted, into the bargain, for a legitimate excuse for deserting his much-hated Swede master. He knew a way to the north and his own country that the white men did not know, a short-cut across an arid plateau where lay waterholes of which the white hunters and explorers that had passed from time to time the fringe of the dry country had never dreamed. He might even elude the big Bwana should he follow them, and with this thought uppermost in his mind he gathered the remnants of Malbian's safari into a semblance of order and moved off toward the north. And toward the southwest the black boy led the Honorable Morrison Baines into the jungles. Korak had waited about the camp, watching the Honorable Morrison until the safari had started north. Then, assured that the young Englishman was going in the wrong direction to meet Miriam, he had abandoned him and returned slowly to the point where he had seen the girl, for whom his heart yearned, in the arms of another. So great had been his happiness at seeing Miriam alive that, for the instant, no thought of jealousy had entered his mind. Later these thoughts had come, dark, bloody thoughts that would have made the flesh of the Honorable Morrison creep, could he have guessed that they were revolving in the brain of a savage creature, creeping stealthily among the branches of the forest giant beneath which he waited the coming of Hansen. And the girl. And with passing of the hours had come subdued reflection, in which he had weighed himself against the trimly clad English gentleman, and found that he was wanting. What had he to offer her by comparison with that which the other man might offer? What was his mess of pottage to the birthright that the other had preserved? How could he dare go, naked and unkempt, to that fair thing who had once been his jungle fellow, and propose the thing that had been in his mind when first the realization of his love had swept over him? He shuddered as he thought of the irreparable wrong that his love would have done the innocent child but for the chance that had snatched her from him before it was too late. Doubtless she knew now the horror that had been in his mind. Doubtless she hated and loathed him as he hated and loathed himself when he let his mind dwell upon it. He had lost her. No more surely had she been lost when he thought her dead than she was in reality, now that he had seen her living in the guise of a refinement that had transfigured and sanctified her. He had loved her before, now he worshipped her. He knew that he might never possess her now, but at least he might see her. From a distance he might look upon her. Perhaps he might serve her, but never must she guess that he had found her or that he lived. He wondered if she ever thought of him, if the happy days that they had spent together never recurred to her mind. It seemed unbelievable that such could be the case, and yet, too, it seemed almost equally unbelievable that this beautiful girl was the same disheveled, half-naked little sprite who skipped nimbly among the branches of the trees as they ran and played in the lazy, happy days of the past. It could not be that her memory held more of the past than did her new appearance. It was a sad Korak who ranged the jungle near the plain's edge, waiting for the coming of his Miriam, the Miriam who never came. But there came another, a tall, broad-shouldered man in khaki, at the head of a swarthy crew of Ebon warriors. The man's face was set in hard, stern lines, and the marks of sorrow were writ deep about his mouth and eyes, so deep that the set expression of rage upon his features could not obliterate them. Korak saw the man pass beneath him where he hid in the great tree that had harbored him before upon the edge of that fateful little clearing. He saw him come, and he sat rigid and frozen in suffering above him. He saw him search the ground with his keen eyes, and he only sat there watching with eyes that glazed from the intensity of his gaze. He saw him sign to his men that he had come upon that which he sought, and he saw him pass out of sight toward the north, and still Korak sat like a graven image, with a heart that bled in dumb misery. An hour later Korak moved slowly away, back into the jungle toward the west. He went listlessly, with bent head and stooped shoulders, like an old man who bore upon his back the weight of a great sorrow. Baines, following his black guide, battled his way through the dense underbrush, riding stooped low over his horse's neck, or often he dismounted where the low branches swept too close to earth to permit him to remain in the saddle. The black was taking him the shortest way, which was no way at all for a horseman, and after the first day's march the young Englishman was forced to abandon his mount and follow his nimble guide entirely on foot. During the long hours of marching the Honorable Morrison had much time to devote to thought, and as he pictured the probable fate of Miriam at the hands of the Swede, his rage against the man became the greater. But presently there came to him a realization of the fact that his own base plans had led the girl into this terrible predicament, and that even had she escaped Hansen she would have found but little better deserts awaiting her with him. There came, too, the realization that Miriam was infinitely more precious to him than he had imagined. For the first time he commenced to compare her with other women of his acquaintance, women of birth and position, and almost to his surprise he discovered that the young Arab girl suffered less than they by the comparison. And then from hating Hansen he came to look upon himself with hate and loathing, to see himself and his perfidious act in all their contemptible hideousness. Thus, in the crucible of shame, amidst the white heat of naked truths, the passion that the man had felt for the girl he had considered his social inferior was transmuted into love. And as he staggered on there burned within him beside his newborn love another great passion, the passion of hate, urging him on to the consummation of revenge. A creature of ease and luxury, he had never been subjected to the hardships and tortures which now were his constant companionship, yet his clothing torn, his flesh scratched and bleeding, he urged the black to greater speed, though with every dozen steps he himself fell from exhaustion. It was revenge which kept him going, that, and a feeling that in his suffering he was partially expiating the great wrong he had done the girl he loved, for hope of saving her from the fate into which he had trapped her had never existed. Too late was the dismal accompaniment of thought to which he marched. Too late to save, but not too late to avenge, that kept him up. Only when it became too dark to see would he permit of a halt. A dozen times in the afternoon he had threatened the black with instant death. When the tired guide insisted upon resting, the fellow was terrified. He could not understand the remarkable change that had so suddenly come over the white man who had been afraid in the dark the night before. He would have deserted this terrifying master had he had the opportunity, but Baines guessed that some such thought might be in the other's mind, and so gave the fellow none. He kept close to him by day and slept touching him at night in the rude thorn boma they constructed as a slight protection against prowling carnivora. That the Honourable Morrison could sleep at all in the midst of the savage jungle was sufficient indication that he had changed considerably in the past 24 hours, and that he could lie close beside a nun too. Fragrant black man spoke of possibilities for democracy within him, yet all undreamed of. Morning found him stiff and lame and sore, but none the less determined to push on in pursuit of Hansen as rapidly as possible. With his rifle he brought down a buck at a ford in a small stream shortly after they broke camp, breakfastless. Begrudgingly he permitted a halt while they cooked and ate, and then on again through the wilderness of trees and vines and underbrush. And in the meantime Korak wandered slowly westward, coming upon the trail of Tantor the elephant, whom he overtook browsing in the deep shade of the jungle. The ape-man, lonely and sorrowing, was glad of the companionship of his huge friend. Affectionately the sinuous trunk encircled him, and he was swung to the mighty back where so often before he had lolled and dreamed the long afternoon away. Far to the north the big Bwana and his black warriors clung tenaciously to the trail of the fleeing safari that was luring them further and further from the girl they sought to save. While back at the bungalow the woman who had loved Miriam as though she had been her own waited impatiently, and in sorrow for the return of the rescuing party and the girl she was positive her invincible lord and master would bring back with him.